A World Cup ends, and FIFA puts out a single headline number, $8.9 billion in tournament revenue. That is a record for any World Cup in history, and it is 54% higher than the last tournament in Qatar only 4 years earlier. On its own, that number tells a simple story. Bigger tournament, bigger business, everything trending in the same direction. But a single total can hide almost as much as it reveals, and this one is hiding something specific. Break that $8.9 billion into its separate pieces, and the pieces did not all grow at the same speed. One piece of this business nearly tripled in size. Another piece barely grew at all. That gap is the real story sitting under the headline. Start with the piece that grew the fastest by far, money made directly from people walking into the stadium. Matchday revenue, mostly ticket sales, jumped from roughly $950 million at Qatar 2022 to close to $3 billion this time. That is a jump of about 216%. Ticket revenue alone more than tripled in a single tournament cycle. Some of that is simple math. 48 teams and 104 matches produce far more tickets to sell than the old 32-team format ever could. But scale alone does not explain the size of that jump. Demand for this specific tournament was unusually high. FIFA reported receiving more than 500 million ticket requests from all 211 of its member countries and territories. Group stage matches sold out at a rate close to 99%, an extraordinary number for matches played months before anyone knew which teams would even advance. Now compare that surge to the piece of revenue that is supposed to be the traditional backbone of a World Cup: broadcast and media rights. Commercial and sponsorship revenue, a separate category, rose too, but only by about 18%, adding roughly $300 million. And broadcast rights, the category that funds live sport more than any other in modern television, grew slower than almost every other piece of the business. So the fastest growing part of this record year was ticketing. The slowest growing part was the traditional broadcast deal. That imbalance is not a coincidence, and it is not really about this one tournament. It points to something changing underneath the entire sport. To understand why broadcast money struggled to keep pace, you have to look at where people were actually watching these matches. Hosting across the United States, Canada, and Mexico meant kickoff times landed at very different hours depending on which continent was watching. For European audiences, some matches kicked off close to 11 at night local time, long after most traditional broadcast audiences had already gone to bed. In France, one broadcaster's usual live audience for a late kickoff fell by roughly 65% compared to an earlier evening match, down to about 4.9 million viewers. A 65% drop on a single channel for a single late match is the kind of number that makes broadcast planners very nervous. But here is the twist. Those viewers did not simply disappear when the traditional broadcast numbers dropped. They moved. Specifically, they moved towards streaming platforms that let people watch on their own schedule, not the broadcasters. In the United States, the clearest evidence of that shift showed up in Spanish-language coverage of the tournament. Through the tournament's first 40 matches, the average minute audience across one network's linear channel and its streaming platform combined reached about 2.3 million viewers per match. That combined figure was up 277% compared to the same stage of the Qatar tournament 4 years earlier. One single match pushed those numbers even higher. Mexico against England drew a total audience of 23.2 million viewers. That made it the most watched Spanish-language soccer broadcast in American television history on any network in any year. English-language coverage set its own record in the same tournament. The United States men's team against Bosnia and Herzegovina drew more than 24 million viewers. That stands as the largest audience ever recorded for an English-language soccer broadcast in the country. So the audience for this tournament did not shrink. If anything, more people watched it than any World Cup before it. What shrank was the share of that audience sitting in front of a single, scheduled linear broadcast channel at exactly the moment a match kicked off. That distinction matters enormously to how media rights get priced, because traditional broadcast deals were built around exactly that kind of scheduled, appointment viewing. A streaming platform can capture a viewer who watches 3 hours late on a phone during a commute. A single linear broadcast slot cannot. So when a broadcaster's live audience number drops, it does not automatically mean fewer people cared about the match. It might just mean fewer people cared about that particular screen at that particular hour. That is a hard number for a traditional broadcast rights negotiation to price, because it is measuring something the old contracts were never designed to measure. Which brings the story back to where the real growth actually landed this tournament. Not broadcast rights, but the stadium gate itself. Ticket prices for group stage matches carried a maximum face value of $575 this tournament. At the previous World Cup, in Qatar, The equivalent group stage maximum was $220, less than half this tournament ceiling. Dynamic pricing pushed some individual group stage tickets well above $1,000, adjusting in real time based on demand for a specific match. For the first time in the tournament's history, FIFA also built and ran its own official resale marketplace for tickets, instead of leaving resale entirely to outside platforms. On that official platform, FIFA takes a cut of 15% from the seller and another 15% from the buyer on every single resale transaction. That means FIFA earns 30% of the total value of a ticket every single time it changes hands on the official resale market. Near the final, that system produced a genuinely startling number. Some regular seats for the championship match were listed for almost $2.3 million each. 4 of those seats listed together added up to more than $9 million for a single group of stadium tickets. On a single resale like that, FIFA's 30% cut alone would come to roughly $690,000 before a single match had even been played. None of that resale revenue depends on a national broadcaster, a rights negotiation, or a scheduled kickoff time in any particular country. It depends only on demand for a physical seat, and FIFA now owns a direct 30% slice of that demand every time it resets. Compare the two revenue engines side by side. One depends on convincing a broadcaster in each country to keep paying more for a shrinking scheduled audience. The other depends only on how many people want to be inside the stadium, and FIFA gets paid whether that seat sells once or gets resold 5 times over. None of this means broadcast rights are becoming worthless. Live sport is still one of the last things people reliably watch as it happens. It means the shape of the deal is changing, and the biggest media companies already know it. Next World Cup media rights cycle is already being shopped, well ahead of the tournament itself, to both traditional networks and streaming platforms. Early reporting on those negotiations put the asking price for the next cycle of rights somewhere in the range of $4 billion combined. That is a number large enough that no single traditional broadcaster is expected to win the whole package outright, the way rights deals often worked in the past. Instead, expect a mix of traditional networks and streaming platforms splitting different pieces of coverage, the same fragmented pattern already visible in this tournament's viewing numbers. The next 2 tournaments on the calendar make that fragmentation even more likely to continue. The next World Cup is scheduled to be hosted jointly by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, spanning 3 countries and 2 continents at once. Special centenary matches to mark 100 years since the very first World Cup are planned in Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay, the tournament's original host region. A tournament spread across that many time zones and that many countries will only make the old idea of one single national broadcast window harder to sustain. The tournament after that is planned for a single host country, Saudi Arabia, which will bring its own entirely different set of broadcast time zones into play. Every one of those future tournaments will be negotiated against the same backdrop this year's numbers just revealed. Ticketing grows fast, broadcast grows slow. So the headline number $8.9 billion was never really lying. It genuinely is a record. But a record built mostly on ticket demand and streaming migration is a very different business than a record built on broadcast rights growth.
One of those foundations can keep compounding almost indefinitely, as long as demand for the sport itself keeps rising.
The other foundation depends on convincing companies to keep paying more for an audience that keeps getting harder to measure with the old tools. That is the real reason FIFA has leaned so heavily into ticketing, resale, and hospitality packages over the last several years. Those revenue lines do not require a single broadcaster in a single country to agree to a single price. They scale directly with how many people want a seat, and FIFA now touches a meaningful share of every seat that changes hands, long after the original sale. It is worth remembering that streaming was barely part of this conversation at the last World Cup only 4 years ago. A Spanish-language broadcast pulling in a majority of its audience through a streaming app instead of a television set was not a data point that existed back then.
4 years later, it is one of the clearest storylines in the entire financial picture of the tournament.
That pace of change is exactly why broadcasters are nervous heading into the next negotiation, and exactly why streaming platforms are pushing so hard to be included in it. Neither side wants to be the one still betting entirely on the old, scheduled, single-channel model 4 years from now. For FIFA itself, the safest strategy is not choosing a side in that fight. It is collecting revenue from both of them at once. A streaming deal, a broadcast deal, and a resale platform can all generate revenue from the exact same match at the exact same time. That layered approach is a big part of why the total kept climbing, even while one specific layer, broadcast rights, grew far more slowly than the rest. It also explains why FIFA had little reason to worry over a 65% drop on one broadcaster's late-night slot in one country. That drop mattered to the broadcaster who signed that specific deal. It barely registered against FIFA's total revenue picture because so many other revenue lines picked up the slack. This is also why comparing this tournament directly to the last one only tells part of the story. Qatar 2022 ran on 32 teams and 64 matches, all packed into a single small country with almost no travel time between venues. This tournament ran on 48 teams and 104 matches, spread across 3 countries roughly the size of a continent. More matches and more countries almost guarantee more total revenue. The real question was always which specific revenue lines grew fastest once the tournament actually happened. And the answer, now that the final numbers are in, is unambiguous. Ticketing and resale grew the fastest. Broadcast rights grew the slowest. There is also a proposal already floating around to expand the tournament even further, to 64 teams and 128 matches. If that expansion ever happens, expect the exact same pattern to repeat itself, only at an even larger scale. More matches would mean more tickets, more resale transactions, and almost certainly another jump in matchday revenue larger than anything broadcast rights alone could match. None of that is guaranteed. Ticket demand depends on where a tournament is held, and not every future host will draw the same crowds a joint United States, Canada, and Mexico tournament did. But the underlying lesson from this tournament's numbers is unlikely to reverse itself on its own. Audiences are not disappearing. They are simply choosing when, where, and on what screen they show up, and the money is following that choice. A record total revenue number, on its own, will always make the best headline. It is the simplest number to print and the easiest one to celebrate. But the number that actually explains what happened sits one layer beneath that headline, in a gap between a piece that tripled and a piece that barely moved. $8.9 billion was the number that made the announcement. 216% versus roughly flat is the number that explains it.
Compound World tracks the systems running underneath the scoreboard everyone actually watches, built on numbers that are checked, never simply assumed.